thevoicebefore-the-void.net. The Facts in the Case of Monsieur Valdemar. From Wikipedia. Read by The Voice Before the Void. The Facts in the Case of Monsieur Valdemar is a short story by American author Edgar Allan Poe about a mesmerist who puts a man in a suspended hypnotic state at the moment of death. An example of a tale of suspense and horror, it is also, to a certain degree, a hoax, as it was published without claiming to be fictional, and many at the time of publication, 1845, took it to be a factual account. Poe toyed with this for a while before admitting it was a work of pure fiction in his marginalia.
So he had a little fun with it.
Analysis. Poe uses particularly detailed descriptions and relatively high levels of gore in the facts in the case of Monsieur Valdemar, displaying his own studies of medical texts. Valdemar's eyes at one point leak a profuse outflowing of a yellowish ichor. For example, though Poe's imagery in the story is best summed up in its final lines, his whole frame at once, within the space of a single minute, or even less, shrunk, crumbled, absolutely rotted away beneath my hands. Upon the bed, before that whole company, there lay a nearly liquid mass of loathsome, of detestable putrescence. Oh, that's a difference from the text I read there. The disgusting imagery almost certainly inspired later fiction, including that of H.P. Lovecraft. These final lines incorporate shock, disgust, and uneasiness into one moment. The ending may also suggest that attempts to appropriate power over death have hideous results, and are bound to be unsuccessful. Geoffrey Myers notes that Valdemar may be roughly translated as Valley of the Sea, perhaps suggesting both solid and liquid states, as emphasized in the imagery deployed as Valdemar's body goes from its normal solid state to liquid in the final lines. Poe typically uses teeth to symbolize mortality, as with sepulchral and disgusting horse's teeth in Metzengerstein, the obsession with teeth in Berenice, and the sound of grating teeth in Hop Frog. Valdemar's death by tuberculosis and the attempts to postpone his death may have been influenced by the experiences of Poe's wife, Virginia. At the time the story was published, she had been suffering from tuberculosis for 4 years. Poe's extreme detail in the facts in the case of Monsieur Valdemar may have been based on Virginia's suffering. Additionally, Poe may have been inspired by Andrew Jackson Davis, whose lectures on mesmerism he had attended. Valdemar's death, however, is not portrayed sentimentally, as Poe's typical theme of the death of a beautiful woman, portrayed in other works such as Ligeia and Morella. In contrast, the death of this male character is brutal and sensational. Publication history. While editor of the Broadway Journal, Poe printed a letter from a New York physician named Dr. A. Sidney Dawn that recounted a surgical operation performed while a patient was in a magnetic sleep. The letter served as inspiration for Poe's tale. The Facts in the Case of Monsieur Valdemar was published simultaneously in the December 20th, 1845 issue of the Broadway Journal and the December 1845 issue of American Review, a Whig journal. The latter journal used the title, The Facts of Monsieur Valdemar's Case. It was also republished in England, first as a pamphlet edition as Mesmerism in Articulu Mortis, and later as The Last Days of Monsieur Valdemar. Reception and critical response. Many readers thought that the story was a scientific report. Robert Collier, an English magnetic healer visiting Boston, wrote to Poe saying that he himself had performed a similar act to revive a man who had been pronounced dead. In truth, the man was actually a drunken sailor who was revived by a hot bath. Collier reported of the story's success in Boston. Your account of Monsieur Valdemar's case has been universally copied in the city, and has created a very great sensation. Another Englishman, Thomas South, used the story as a case study in his book Early Magnetism in its Higher Relations to Humanity, published in 1846. A medical student, George C. Eveleth, wrote to Poe, I have strenuously held that it was true, but I tell you that I strongly suspect it for a hoax. A Scottish reader named Archibald Ramsay wrote to Poe, as a believer in mesmerism, asking about the story. It details most extraordinary circumstances, he wrote, concerned that it had been labeled a hoax. For the sake of science and of truth, he requested an answer from Poe himself. Poe's response was that hoax is precisely the word suited. Some few persons believe it, but I do not, and don't you. Poe received many similar letters, and replied to one such letter from a friend. P.S. The Valdemar case was a hoax, of course. In the Daily Tribune, its editor, Horace Greeley, noted that several good matter-of-fact citizens were tricked by the story. But whoever thought it a veracious recital must have the bump of faith large, very large indeed. Elizabeth Barrett Browning wrote to Poe about the story to commend him on his talent for making horrible improbabilities seem near and familiar. The Virginia poet, Philip Pendleton Cook, also wrote to Poe, calling the story the most damnable, vraisemblable, horrible, hair-lifting, shocking, ingenious chapter of fiction that any brain ever conceived or hand traced. That gelatinous, viscous sound of man's voice. There never was such an idea before.
That was arresting.
George Edward Woodbury wrote that the story, for mere physical disgust and foul horror, has no rival in literature.
No rival.
James M. Hutchison refers to the story as probably Poe's most gruesome tale.
Yeah.
Rudyard Kipling, an admirer of Poe, references the facts in the case of Monsieur Valdemar in his story In the House of Sudhu, which suggests the disastrous results of the sorcery used by a man trying to save his sick son's life. One spell requires the head of a dead baby, which seems to speak. The narrator says, "Read Poe's account of the voice that came from the mesmerized dying man, and you will realize less than one half of the horror of that head's voice." Okay.
Oh.
Kind of got you right there, Dan, huh?
Yeah.